And if you can open your Bibles in the book of Nehemiah and chapter 3, that would be helpful. Nehemiah chapter 3, because you're probably using different translations of the Bible. I'm not sure what page number that would be on, but it's just before the Psalms and Job and the book of Esther. That's where you'll find the book of Nehemiah, and we're in chapter 3. We're just spending a few weeks looking at this book and the story, just picking up some of the main lessons from this book. And today we come to this third chapter, and in many ways it's a difficult passage. It's a difficult passage even to read, because there's an awful lot of difficult names, and so I've perhaps chickened out a little bit in this, and I'm not going to read the passage now, but perhaps you can read it for yourselves afterwards. There's a long list of very difficult names to express, and I must be honest, when I was looking at this passage in preparation for today, I was tempted not just to skip over reading it, but skip over the passage altogether. But I've come to see that it really is an important passage for us, and it contains some very important lessons for us to take into account in our studies in the book of Nehemiah. What we have here really is a detailed account of how Nehemiah achieved the impossible. Over a couple of pages in chapter 6 and verse 15, we read, "So the wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul, in 52 days. In just 52 days, the wall was completed, less than 2 months. Now that's quite an amazing achievement, isn't it? This wall, as we've said before, was something like 2.5 miles in circumference. It was the average height was around 12 meters. The average thickness was 2.5 meters. It had 34 watchtowers and was divided into 7 sections with 7 large gates, main entrances to the city on all sides. They had no modern machinery. They were constantly harassed by Sanballat and Tobias, and yet they managed to complete this work in just 52 days. Well, how did they manage it? How did Nehemiah manage to achieve the impossible? Well, of course, the critics of the Bible say that it is impossible and that it wasn't done. They, of course, come up with their explanations, and that it would be completely impossible for Nehemiah to have achieved this work. And yet the Bible says that he did it, and we, as Christians and as evangelicals, we believe every word of the Bible, every word of the Bible is true and inspired and useful for us. He did it. He accomplished what seemed to be the impossible. Well, how did he manage that? Well, of course, the short answer, the quick answer to that question is that God was with him. This was God's doing. You remember how in chapter 2 and verse 8, you remember right at the end of that verse, he says, "And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of God was upon me." For the good hand of God was upon me. And that was true, not just in his asking for permission from King Artaxerxes, but it was true in the accomplishment of the work and every aspect of the work from then on. And that's really the only explanation here, isn't it? God was with him. And as we read in the Word of God, nothing is impossible with God. And we need to give glory to him. And in fact, that's exactly what Nehemiah himself does. So again, in chapter 6 and in verse 16, we read this, "And when all our enemies heard of it, the completion of the wall, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God." And that affected everyone around. All the nations around could see that God was with them, and that God had helped them to accomplish this work and to achieve what seemed to be impossible. Well, that's the easy answer. That's the quick answer. But we'd have to say, that there's more to it even than that, isn't there? It's good to recognize that. But we need to give God the glory, of course. But there are some very practical and very important lessons for us to learn from Nehemiah's example here in this passage as well. And what I want to do with you this morning is just look at three things. There's three titles, if you like, three headings. I'll give you them straight away so you know how we're going. I want to look at the strategy that Nehemiah used. That's the largest point that we'll be looking at this morning. So most of our time will be spent on looking at the strategy of Nehemiah. But then secondly, I want to notice very briefly something of his success. And thirdly, his absence. So his strategy, his success, and his absence. So let's begin then looking at the strategy of Nehemiah in this job, in this work that God had given him to do. Now, in any work that we undertake, it's always important to know where to begin, isn't it? And Nehemiah knows exactly where to begin. Look at verses 1 to 3 and look at the verbs that are used in those verses. Let me read verses 1 to 3. Then Eliashib the high priest rose up with his brothers the priests, and they built the sheep gate. They consecrated it and set up its doors. They consecrated it as far as the Tower of the 100, as far as the Tower of Hanael. And next to him the men of Jericho built, and next to them Zachar the son of Imri built. The sons of Hasenah built the fish gate. They laid its beams and set up its doors, its bolts and its bars. And then there's a change. The verbs that he uses in verses 1 to 3, the verb that he uses often, and he uses it repeatedly, is built. They built, they did this, they built that, and so on. But then in verse 4 and following, all the way through to the end of the chapter, you notice there's a difference. And next to them, Meremoth, the son of Uriah, son of Hazok, repaired. And next to them, Meshullam, the son of Berechiah, son of Meshezabel, repaired, and so on, all the way through. Repaired. Verses 1 to 3 is built. Verses 4 and following is all about them repairing. Now, it seems to indicate there seems to be a difference stated there. It seems to indicate, doesn't it, that they started where the damage was the greatest, because it was a rebuilding job, not just a repair job. They started at the point of the greatest need. Now, that was borne out in the history of Israel. Verses 1 to 3, those references to the gates and the towers and so on, they all appeared on the northern side of the city of Jerusalem. And you remember how Jeremiah, in his prophecy, when he's prophesying the coming of the Babylonians, this is before the time of the exile, and he's writing to the Israelites and warning them of this impending doom. And he talks about Babylon in terms of being a cauldron from the north, and that this wrath would be poured out from the north. And that's exactly what happened. The Babylonians came from the north, and the walls were battered most on the northern side of Jerusalem. The damage was most extensive on the northern side. So that's where the work begins. That's where Nehemiah sets these people working. Now, I think there's a very important principle for us there, isn't there? For us today as well. We need to identify what is the point of the greatest need. Martin Luther, in his time of, in the time of the Reformation, Martin Luther, of course, the great reformer, the one that God used to build up the church and to bring it out of darkness, and there was a great fight on his hands, wasn't there? Of course, during that time, he stood against the whole world, and the Roman Catholic Church, of course, opposed him at every point. But Martin Luther said this during that time. He said, to be fighting manfully on every front, except where the battle is raging, is cowardice. We need to be fighting. We need to be where the fighting is the fiercest. Now that's true, isn't it? And it's true in every walk of life. It's true in every job that we have to do. It's true in every battle that we face. I can remember when we were at school, we were made to play rugby. Of course, the game we all wanted to play was football, but we were made to play rugby. And those of us who weren't very good at rugby, we had a very good strategy. We would run around all over the pitch so that the teacher couldn't criticize us and tell us to do something. We'd run around everywhere except for where the ball was. We didn't want to touch the ball because we didn't want to get attacked. We didn't want to get tackled or anything. We were cowards, basically, weren't we? Well, that's what a lot of us did. Now, we can be like that as evangelicals, can't we? Today, we can be so busy. We can be doing this and doing that. We can go to this conference and that conference. We can read this book and that book. We can fight among ourselves regarding all kinds of secondary and trivial matters, can't we? And we look very impressive when we're doing it. We look very spiritual when we're doing it. And yet we can be doing all of that far from where the battle is really raging. In Luther's day, the battle that was the fiercest, the fiercest battle that he was facing really was the doctrine of justification by faith alone. Salvation, justification by faith alone. That was what had been covered up for centuries. That was the one truth that needed to be rediscovered, and it was the one thing that he battled most for. But where is the battle today? I think we need to take even a step further back than Luther and his time. The battle's different today, isn't it? I think the fiercest battle really is, what is faith? What is faith? It's not even justification by faith alone anymore. It's what is faith? Because the church is so confused on this matter, and we can so easily fall into disrepair because we're not fighting on the true issue, the real matter, the real issue that is the fiercest today. What is faith? Is it just saying, "Oh yes, I believe," and that's it, and you carry on with your life and you never, do anything else? Is that it? Is that it? Just accepting Christ, as many would say? Oh, faith is so deep, isn't it? There's so much to it, and we need to be clear on that matter. But the point I'm trying to make is that we're not to be fighting yesterday's battles, because when we do, we become irrelevant, don't we? And it's a principle that's important for us to apply, not just on a national level. It's true that we need to apply this on a local level as well, as a local church, don't we? What are our spiritual priorities, rather? What are our spiritual priorities today in our local church? There's an awful lot of things that can be done. We can be doing all sorts of things. We can be running around the pitch, but anywhere where the ball is, can't we? Where is our greatest need? Someone once said, and it's often repeated, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And that's very, very true, isn't it? It's a constant battle, isn't it, to keep the main thing the main thing. I came across a book some time ago called The Tyranny of the Urgent. The Tyranny of the Urgent. And it's true, isn't it? It does tend to be a bit of a tyranny. We're always, the urgent is always crying out for attention. Something urgent needs to be done, and that's good, and we need to do that. But the problem with that is that the necessary tends not to get done because we're always busy with the urgent. And so the point is we need to prioritize, don't we? Nehemiah, he could have started anywhere, but he starts at the point of the greatest need. He starts where the damage has been done the most. And then before we move on, we need to apply that personally as well, don't we? Where do you need to start? Do you know? Perhaps you look at your spiritual life, your life as a Christian, and perhaps you look at everything and you think to yourself, it's just a mess. I'm not what I ought to be. And after perhaps being a Christian for many, many years, you think to yourself, well, I should be far down the line than I am, and how much progress have I really made? And sometimes you look at your Christian life and you think to yourself, well, where do I begin? There's so much wrong with my Christian life. Where do I begin? The Puritans, they used to speak an awful lot about self-examination, the need to examine oneself. Today, that's pretty much a dirty word today, isn't it, in our Christian circles? Many people would criticize anyone who talks in favor of self-examination and the need for it. They come back and they say, well, that's just morbid introspection. We don't need to be looking at ourselves. We just need to be looking at Christ. Well, of course, self-examination is meant to drive us to Christ, but we're not supposed to jump over it. If we never examine ourselves, then there's something wrong. You remember what Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 when he's talking about the Lord's table, and there's so much instruction there about the Lord's table, isn't there? And you remember what he says in verse 28. He says, therefore let a person examine himself, and then come and take the bread and the wine. Let a person examine himself. He urges us to examine ourselves. Well, do we? Do we even know how to do that? I wonder. We've lost focus on this. We've lost this emphasis, haven't we, that the Puritans had. And we need to ask ourselves. We need to be able to examine ourselves and ask ourselves, well, where am I the weakest? What is my weakest point? What is my besetting sin, as the scripture speaks of it? What is my besetting sin? It'll be different for you and it'll be different for me. But what is my besetting sin? Start there. That's what Nehemiah is saying to us, isn't it? Start there. Yes, there's an awful lot of things you might do. And it might be good to do. But you need to start at the point of greatest need, the point where you're perhaps weakest of all. You remember when Jesus spoke to Martha and Mary and Martha, and Martha's busy in the kitchen, isn't she? And she comes out and she complains that he hasn't made her sister help her. And you remember what Jesus says? He says, Martha, Martha, you're troubled about many things, but one thing is needed. One thing is needed. Well, what's needed in your life? What's the one point where you need to start building again? Now, that's part of the strategy of Nehemiah. He starts at the point of greatest need, but then there's more to his strategy. The second thing that I want to say under this first heading is that Nehemiah obviously thought about how to divide the work up. 2.5 miles of wall is a long way, and the job must have seemed very, very daunting to everyone involved, I'm sure. But what Nehemiah does here in this passage is he divides it up into 40 separate sections. And each section is assigned to a family group in order to rebuild and to repair. Now that's very wise, isn't it, when you think about it? It's very wise. I think that's what Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 6, in that passage where he's talking about worry and anxiety. You remember he says there in verse 34, he says, therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, For tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. It's interesting, isn't it? He's talking about life and worry and anxiety. And life can seem very, very daunting, can't it? You know, maybe you wonder about retirement and whether you're going to manage and so on. And you think about the long life ahead of you, perhaps, and how are you going to manage? What will happen if I live till I'm 100? How am I going to cope and so on? Well, Jesus says, just one day at a time. Break it up into manageable bits. Break it up into manageable pieces. Isn't that part, at least, of what he's saying there in that passage? Break it up. Divide it. Make it more manageable. Carl Henry was the editor of Christianity Today in America for a good number of years, and he, with a number of other people, were often asked to go and speak in conferences and universities in all over the United States. And one day, he and a friend of his were invited to speak in this one particular conference. They turned up. It was a university. They turned up to the university, and everything was ready. The hall was prepared. The seats were laid out. The lectern was in place. Everything was ready, but nobody came. And when he asked why nobody had come, the man who was organizing it had to confess that he had tried to do everything himself, and he had forgotten the most important thing of all. That was to advertise the meeting. Nobody knew about it, and so nobody came. He'd done everything else, but he'd forgotten that one thing, because he was trying to do it all himself, and that's the problem, isn't it? That's not how Nehemiah approaches this work. He could never have done it himself, of course. It was far too big. And so what does he do? Well, in effect, he divides and conquers. He divides the work up, and it becomes more manageable. And so God helped them as they were building. And throughout the passage, you notice there's a recurring phrase again: next to him, next to him, next to him. And I won't read it now, but all the way through the passage, it keeps on saying, and next to him, so-and-so built, and next to them, so-and-so built. There were no gaps. And everyone was side by side, building this work, doing the section that had been allocated to them. And you notice how he allocates. Again, it's not haphazard, is it? It's a wonderful passage, really. It's a very important lessons for us. But look at verse 10, for example. It says, next to them, Jediah, the son of Harumpah, repaired opposite his house. Verse 23, he says, after them, Azariah, the son of Maaseiah, and the son of, these names are so difficult, aren't they? Ananiah repaired beside his house. And then you get the same again in verse 29 and again in verse 30. 4 times we're told, opposite his house, opposite their house, and so on. Now, that makes very good sense, doesn't it? Nehemiah allocated these families the part of the job that was right opposite their homes, and that makes perfectly good sense. It means there was no commuting. It means they could be home for dinner. It means that when they were attacked, and they were right there where they wanted to be. If they were attacked and they were some other part of the city, I'm sure their minds would have been on their homes and their families, and they want to run home first of all. But no, they were able to defend their family home because they were working right opposite where they lived. And that was that's such an important principle. Just think about the pride that they would take in it as well. The pride in the work, opposite our home. This is the part that we built. And that's a tremendously practical thing for Nehemiah to have done. And again, isn't there a spiritual principle there for us? I'm not trying to over spiritualize the passage, but there is a principle here for us, isn't there? I think that's where God's work always begins, isn't it? At home. That's where we're to start. I mean, the principles brought out in Acts chapter 1, you remember, when the disciples are, waiting. The Lord Jesus Christ is about to be lifted up and be taken away from them and hidden by a cloud. And then as they're waiting, they're asking him questions, aren't they? Asking him about the coming of the kingdom and Jerusalem and so on. And Jesus says, look, it's not about that. Don't you worry about that. What I want you to be doing is to be witnesses, and I want you to be witnesses in all the world. And it's Luke's account, really, of the Great Commission, isn't it? A second account of the Great Commission. But you notice what Jesus says. I want you to be witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the uttermost parts of the earth. Jerusalem first. Start there. That's home for them, isn't it? And that's where the work began, and it spreads out like ripples in a pond. They spread out from there outwards, but it all began in Jerusalem. And home is the place where we are to start again, isn't it? We're to think about that. We're to prioritize. There's the story of a young woman, a young mother. She was a mother of 10. And she was converted under the ministry of D.L. Moody, the American evangelist at the end of the 19th century. And she wrote a letter to D.L. Moody explaining that she'd been converted and that she wanted to go on and serve the Lord. And she had a great desire to go to the uttermost parts of the earth, and she wanted to preach the gospel to people who had never heard it before and so on. And she wrote this letter to Moody. And I do love Moody's wisdom in his reply, because he simply said, amongst other things in his letter, he said, I'm so glad to hear that you desire to spread the word, and I'm even happier to hear that God has already given you a congregation. And he's referring, of course, to her children. Start there. Now, that's often the hardest place for us to build, isn't it? But there's nothing sadder than to see Christians active in many other aspects of their life, in many other things, while their home life is in a mess. And it shouldn't be. Now, I'm not saying just stay at home and never do anything else, of course. There's work to be done. And these people here, when they'd finished the section that they'd been given, many of them moved on to another. But the principle's there, isn't it? It's so important that our family life and our home is right. Well, that's his strategy. So let me move on very, very briefly to his success and his absence. Think about his success to begin with here. Not just the fact that they completed the work in 52 days, but the fact that he managed to get the whole city working. It's quite incredible, isn't it? He's somehow able to motivate and to mobilize everyone. Well, almost. Because there's one exception, isn't there? And this one exception is so stark, it stands out like a sore thumb in this whole passage. Look at verse 5. It says, and next to them the Tekoites repaired, but their nobles would not stoop to serve their Lord. Their nobles would not stoop to serve their Lord. Just imagine the situation. It's very sobering, that verse. It's very, very serious, isn't it? Just think about it. At a time when God is at work, when the good hand of God is upon Nehemiah and the people of Israel, when God has enabled Nehemiah to enthuse the people, and everyone comes out to work, they're all rolling up their sleeves to get on with the job, and everyone gets busy. These Tekoite nobles, they simply stand and watch. They refuse to lift a finger to help. Why? Why? Well, when you look at that phrase in verse 5, surely the implication is that it was their pride. The nobles would not stoop to serve their Lord. Really? Is he really their Lord? They would not stoop. They thought it was beneath them to do such a job. Pride is a terrible thing, isn't it? And here we see that pride can rob us of so much blessing. There were all kinds of people involved in this work. When you read through the passage, when you read through the whole chapter, you find that there were priests and there were farmers, there were goldsmiths, there were businessmen and chemists and town councillors. There was men and women. Verse 12 talks about the daughters of this man who was a ruler of half the district of Jerusalem. He repaired, and he and his daughters. He's a ruler, and yet he's not ashamed. He doesn't look at it as beneath him to serve, and he even gets his daughters involved. It's a wonderful picture, isn't it? This what's going on here. So what a reproach for these nobles of Tekoa. It seems that even their own people were embarrassed by them, doesn't it? You look over the page in verse 27, and you see what he says. Verse 27, after him, the Tekoites repaired another section opposite the great projecting tower as far as the wall of Ophel. They repaired another section. They didn't sort of, oh, well, we've done our bit. They got down to doing another section as well. When they'd finished their part, and they were not the only ones. The same kind of expression appears in verse 11, verse 19, 21, 24, and 27. Lots of people were doing it. There was no one standing around saying, "Oh, well, we've done our bit." Sort of fold our hands and watch the rest struggle on. We've done our bit. No, they got on with it. Another section if they'd finished their own. And Nehemiah has great success in this work, doesn't he? The whole city seems to come out. The whole city turns out to help. And look at verse 14. It's worth a mention. It's all of these men, of course, are given, and women are given credit for the work here. But look at verse 14. It's perhaps particularly worth underlining. It says, Melchijah, how do you pronounce that name? The son of Rechab, ruler of the district of Beth Hacherem, repaired the dung gate. He built it and set up its doors, its bolts, and its bars. Interesting, isn't it? Here's this ruler of a particular district in Jerusalem. He's a ruler, and yet he repaired the dung gate. He was given the toilet block to fix. Well, that can't have been a very nice job. And yet he's glad to do it in the service of the Lord. And even some people that weren't even living in Jerusalem came to help, isn't it? Verse 2 mentions the people of Jericho. There's no parochialism here. It wasn't just the Jerusalemites. It was others from other towns around. They all came together. Everyone came to work, shoulder to shoulder, united in the task. And isn't that a wonderful picture of what the church is meant to be? You remember the way that Paul describes the church in the book of Philippians, and he speaks there in Philippians, this wonderful chapter of Paul's, where he talks about for to me to live is Christ, to die is gain. And he explains to us in all of that passage what it means to live for Christ and for death to be gain. He talks about all of this and his own priorities in the passage, and all of the things that really mean something, the really most important to him, his priorities. And then in verse 27 of chapter 1 in Philippians, he says this: only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come to see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. You see what he's saying there? This is my priorities, he says. My priorities, the gospel, the salvation of people, the edification of the church, the glory of Christ in my own life. They're the things that he's mentioning in that passage. And then he says, only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel. Well, how are we going to be living worthy of the gospel? Well, he explains to us. So that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you are standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. I want to hear. This is the only thing that I'm asking. You notice that how he begins that verse. Only let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel. And this worthy of the God, this is the one thing that he wants. This is the one thing that makes him happy, isn't it? And he goes on and says more about it in chapter 2 and the first few verses. This is the one thing I want to see, that you're standing side by side, working together for the faith of the gospel. What we have here then in Nehemiah is a wonderful picture of the church, how it ought to be. The whole church working together, side by side, praying together, committing together, being dedicated to one another. As we see in the early chapters of Acts, the people devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and the breaking of bread and prayer, devoting themselves to these things. That's what commitment's all about. That's building, isn't it? That's the building of the church. That's what we're meant to be doing, side by side. Well, he has great success. Nehemiah here, we see him with his strategies, very wise, and his success is quite incredible. It's something that only God can achieve through him. But then lastly, and just very briefly, I want to mention his absence here, and it will be very brief. Just mention his absence. What we have here in this chapter is a long list of names. But you don't get Nehemiah's name mentioned at all. It's interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you read through it, you'll see that in verse 16, there is a Nehemiah, but he's a different Nehemiah. He's got a different father. He's a different man completely. He's not the Nehemiah that we're looking at in these studies. He's a different man altogether. So where's Nehemiah? Where is he? Well, is he gone somewhere else? Well, of course not. Surely it's not too much to see here that Nehemiah is there, right with them in the work. He's recording the work, who's doing what. He's encouraging them. He's motivating them. He's congratulating them on the work accomplished. He's leading them and advising them. Surely he's there all the time, isn't he? And he writes all of these names down except his own. What a contrast that is to Nebuchadnezzar himself, who had caused this destruction. You remember in the book of Daniel and in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is there on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And in chapter 4, verse 30, we read, "And the king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" Nebuchadnezzar's filled with pride, and he takes the glory. And you remember what happens. God takes his sanity, at least for a few years. Well, Nehemiah is so different. He gives the credit to others and the glory to God. Psalm 115 verse 1 says, "Not unto us, O Lord, not unto us, but unto your name be the glory, for the sake of your steadfast love and your faithfulness." Well, may that be our longing and desire as we seek to serve him in our own day, as we seek to build up the walls in our own lives. Well, may the Lord help us and lead us and guide us. I'm just going to